All right. This is Brent Rains for Alternate Perceptions Online Magazine, and it's Wednesday morning, October the 19th, 2022, of course, and I'm with someone that any of you who have been in the field for very, very long at all, the name Peter Jordan may ring a bell. In fact, I just this morning picked up an old issue of Saga magazine's UFO report from August of 1978.
Wow.
And there was an article on spooklights by Peter Jordan and another author, and it reminded me, like, hey, I need to get up out of bed. I'm going to be interviewing Peter Jordan here in a moment. It's like a wake-up call, you know?
Yeah.
So, actually, I originally started reading this magazine because of an article on Kundalini by John White. But
that's a really good, John White, wonderful researcher.
Wonderful researcher. I guess he's passed now.
Yeah, he passed some time ago. I knew John. Yeah, that bringing up some great memories. Yep. Yeah. But it was a great magazine too. It had a lot of noteworthy people in it. I think you wrote for it too, didn't you?
Well, I had letters to the editor at the time. I tried to write an article, it got rejected. But wow. You know how that goes.
Oh my God. Okay.
But I did write for one New York magazine, UFO Update. I wrote a couple articles for they.
Yeah, I wrote for them too. Yeah.
But so many. But yeah, you know, Saga's UFO report. That was the go-to place years ago if you were interested in UFOs.
And then fate, for those of us that sort of straddled the fence, as it were, between all things Fortean. You know, I always considered myself more of a Fortean in that my interests were very varied. So while some were in this camp, you know, where they're only talking about Bigfoot or only writing about Bigfoot, and specialized magazines and newsletters designed for those or oriented around those. I was writing for Fate magazine about the paranormal, hauntings, poltergeists, spontaneous human combustion, you name it. I was interested in it. So Fortean Times was always, and still is, to me, you know, one of the greatest magazine, other than Pursuit, which probably most of our listeners, I'm going to say, are not going to be familiar with. And that's a shame, because Pursuit was a wonderful newsletter put out by the Society for the Investigation of Things Unexplained, which was run, of course, by Ivan Sanderson.
Right.
The late, great Ivan Sanderson, you know?
Yeah. Who was a good friend of John Keel, and for a while Keel was actually editing Pursuit, as I recall. When
he sure was.
When Ivan Sanderson took ill.
Yeah, and then a little history, which you may probably know, is Stan Gordon was a member of Situ, right? And he was a member of Situ along with the former president of my group, Vestigia, Bob Jones, who passed some years ago. So Bob Jones and Stan Gordon were both Bigfoot researchers, would do a lot of the research for Situ and write the articles up and, you know, write the publications up. And we're very close to Ivan Sanderson. I'm jealous of that fact, because out of all the people that were out there, I never got to meet other than Carl Jung and Freud and, you know, that whole group. I always wished I had had an opportunity to meet Ivan Sanderson and work with him, you know, because he was really amazing. And John Keel said to me, I asked him once when I started my lecture circuit, I said, you know, he said to me, I don't know how you stand these college kids. They're so stupid. He goes, you know, when I was lecturing, they would like fall asleep. They couldn't follow what I was talking about. He goes, and I wasn't talking about anything that I thought was so deep, but if I started going off on a tangent to UFOs or something they weren't interested in, they would just tune me out. He says, they just have that kind of mentality. I don't know how you do it. And I said, yeah. And I said, well, you know, there's some that have been very successful at it. Like Stanton Friedman was pretty big on the college circuit for a long time. I used to go see him And then I realized it's the same lecture. It reminded me of going to see a comedian that's doing the same act over and over. He had the same catchphrases. It was the same thing every single time. And I thought, wow, this is getting to be kind of boring, you know? But I never got to, so Keel, talking about lectures, said to me, there's only two of the greatest lectures of all time. Guess who they are? I go, who? He goes, Ivan Sanderson and Dr. Frank Stranges. And I said, Dr. Frank Stranges, he goes, if you never got an opportunity to see him, he is the most mesmerizing and engaging speaker you will ever have seen in your life. I was stunned to hear that. I couldn't believe it, but I guess it makes sense because he was what, an evangelist or a minister. Sanderson, I knew from listening to him on the Long John Nebel show, just had that wonderful voice. And he's just so professorial and so professional and so interesting. And his books, my gosh, you know, people need to go back and to reread if they can find these books, which you can do, unless, it's hard to find some of them because they've never been reprinted. And so there's collector's items and you have to spend $500 to $1,000 on eBay because the collectors have bought them all up.
Oh, yeah. It's ridiculous. And because of their friendship, between John Keel and Ivan Sanderson, in your conversation with John Keel, did Keel ever talk about the fact that when he wrote his book Operation Trojan Horse, that came out in 1970, in the beginning, he and Ivan Sanderson were going to write this book together?
Oh, I didn't hear that. No, you know something I don't know. No, I didn't know that.
Okay. Well, they, for whatever reason, it didn't work out that way. Keel ended up writing it himself. Because Ivan Sanderson wrote Invisible Residence and
great book.
And of course, he wrote a book on Bigfoot, or Abominable Snowman, I think it was called.
And he was one of the first people I knew of that talked about USOs. Underwater stuff. Now people talk about them as if it's new. They say, "Oh, did you know that UFOs are attracted to water?" That's why I just have a hard time sometimes with people that don't have a sense of history. I mean, how could you get interested in this or be involved in this and not know some of the basic things that have happened, or it's some of the basic bibliography that people should be reading or going back and finding so they could get more familiar with it? They just don't know. And they talk about things as if it's a new discovery. Everything's a new discovery. It's not a new discovery.
Yeah, I was surprised a few years back, a little over a decade ago. I was interviewing Ann Druffel, well-known researcher in California.
Absolutely.
Who started out with NICAP, I guess, back in the late 50s. And she's written about, contact experiences. D. Scott Rogo co-authored with her. And in the interview, I mentioned John Keel. And I don't know if it was a memory glitch or what, but she says, "Who is that?" And of course, for a while there, Keel seemed to people were forgetting about him in the field. I think he went.
But I don't. But that seems astonishing to me. So unless Ann Druffel was having a big senior moment, I mean, I don't know her age was at that particular. Because she passed. When did she pass?
I guess about 3 years ago, maybe.
Right. So when you were interviewing her, was she pretty elderly, or she was still had her senses?
She was getting up there, but I mean, we talked about a lot of different cases. She just had a book that I primarily focused on, where she was. I'm trying to remember the title. It was a book on if you'd had a traumatic UFO encounter experience and your experiences were very negative seeming. Different methods to try to bring it under control. And
right.
And so, she cited a lot of the details, the cases. Her mind seemed really sharp on all that. And
okay, well, that's unless she was being sarcastic. But that's really, I'm really shocked by that, because I knew Rogo very well, Scott. I used to go to parapsychology conferences, with him in attendance. Actually, Dr. Berthold Schwarz, whom we both knew very well, and who talk about someone who's been forgotten and shouldn't be forgotten, because remember, on my background in psychology, and I was desperately trying to find psychiatrists or psychologists who were interested in this topic that I could interact with. Let me tell you something. Talk about almost an impossibility. I mean, other than Jan Arenwald, right? Psychiatrist who wrote that great book, which I still have, coffee table sized book on Ted Sirios, which is still a case to me that I think is absolutely astonishing. You know, other than him and maybe one or two other people, there were no psychiatrists that were willing to even discuss this, you know. Right. Dr. Schwarz always surprised me because he was the only one I knew that not only talked about it, wrote about it, and not only wrote about it, didn't write about it from a skeptical point of view, wrote about it from as objective a point of view as he possibly could, and talk about detailed analysis, clinical analysis of everything, you know, researching the possible psychopathology within a particular case involving the percipients, you know, looking at that, looking at all the other connections, all the other possible attendant phenomenon having to do with a Bigfoot sighting, not throwing the baby out with the dishwater, but saying, well, I'm going to include everything and I'm going to footnote this thing to death for those who would like to dig in a little deeper. And that is something that you just, again, that's a rarity.
Oh, yeah.
When you see something like that, you know, when you see something that's annotated and footnoted to death like that, like I said, other than Kevin Randall, there's a few people that are more from an academic point of view, and they have this clinical, you know, he's a clinical psychologist. He was trained as a clinical psychologist, Randall.
Oh, okay.
So he has two things going for him that I've always admired. You know, he was in the services. He knows aircraft. He knows how it works in the Army, right? In the Air Force. He knows what protocols are. He knows what top secret means. He knows if somebody probably is telling the truth about an experience or not, based on military experience and all the jargon and all that goes into it. And then he's got this wonderful background in psychology, you know, and he wrote a great book on abduction. It's a skeptical book. But I have to tell you, it's a wonderful guide for people that aren't decided as to what they believe. It's another point of view about a lot of the abductions and a lot of the cases he was involved with personally, with, for example, James Harder, who did a lot of the regressive hypnosis. And a lot of the hypnosis, when you look at how it's done, the controls aren't good. There's leading questions being asked. There's a lot of possible confabulation, the confounding issues. So this is such a complex field and such a complex group of phenomena that we're dealing with, that simply to step back and say, well, I don't think there's any connection between what happened here with these lights that this family saw and the Bigfoot that they saw that killed all their chickens in the backyard. We can't say that. How can you say that without looking at it? And what is the fault with those who actually just include it? Not to say that, oh, this is definitely proof that there's something paranormal. It simply means we have something that happened in that area at the same time, and we should consider it. And that's what Schwarz did in his books. He said, look, let's look at all the other things that were going on around this. Let's look at Betty Hill. And let's look at all the things that happened before she had the UFO abduction. And let's look at all the other things that happened after it. You know, and all the synchronicities, all of the strange thing, and her own Bigfoot sighting and so forth and so on. Include all of it so we can get a more comprehensive view of what's going on in these individual cases. That's been my point of view from the very beginning. And that's why some people used to say to me, even when I would do lectures, at the end, they would go, what is it? What exactly do you believe? You're all over the place. You know, when we hear you up there, you're saying, well, this is fake, but this case seemed to have some merit, but not a lot. And this case you think is genuine, but you never take a hard view about anything. And that's something I think is a fault with and that I think is just basic human psychology. I think people like to just have one thing in their head about something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Maybe it's the way that our brain is. Maybe it's evolution. Maybe it's just that we can't handle more than one thing. Maybe there's just a little box and we got to put everything in that box and we can't go outside of it. And I used to see it over and over again. And I know you have too. Anyone who's a Fortean knows what we're talking about. If you're truly someone who's Fortean, then you say, well, like Charles Fort said, I don't know, there's all this weird stuff and there's all these weird synchronicities. What it means, I don't know. If there's a God, must he be sane? Remember that?
Yeah, I remember that.
Okay, and that kind of was Keel's whole point of view about this is all demonic, and again, this goes back to the psychology of people, including the investigator. I always found it interesting, and I'm not the first one to point this out, that if you took someone like, let's say, Dr. Leo Sprinkle performed all these regression hypnosis on supposed abductees and all that, the experiences were always benign. They were always pretty nice. They weren't like horrible, They weren't people doing terrible medical experiments. They were more like almost like the contactee experiences of the 1950s. They were a lot more light and fluffy, like Leon. You knew Leo, didn't you? Sprinkle was just the nicest guy in the world. He didn't have a point of view. Like if you pressed him and said, "What do you think it is?" I don't know. I'm just presenting what I'm doing. But what was interesting is what tumbled out of those hypnosis sessions was very different than what Bud Hopkins' results were, right?
Mm-hmm.
Bud Hopkins's abduction experiences were always just really frightening. They were never good. I don't know of any that were good. Okay.
Yeah, and I think it's with like Bud Hopkins, I remember John Keel saying that he tried to school Hopkins a little bit on hypnosis and what it does, and he was never interested in reading the books that Keel had recommended, and he really wasn't a professional. He would just learn some technique there to hypnotize people, and
right, exactly,
and proceeded with that. And I understand. I heard from somewhere that someone was talking about poltergeist manifestations or something at their home, and he advised them, we don't talk about that here.
Yeah, he did that. Yeah. So I got to meet Hopkins in, I forget what year it was. It might have been around the time that he was writing Intruders. I'm not sure. It's been so long. But I would make my way into the city quite a bit. And I think I was with a group of other people. I forget who the other researchers were. And we went to one of his support group sessions. So I got to just sit there. But he basically told me, I just want you to know that this is basically like a private session. I'll let you sit in, but you can't make any comments, and please do not try to interject or to make any kind of commentary on this. This is therapeutic. And I thought, okay. So I sat there and I watched this whole thing, and I thought, wow, no one within that particular group, I'm talking about the abductees, the experiencers, none of them were suggesting to Hopkins, like even when they would say, I thought, well, maybe I wasn't experiencing missing time, that maybe it was something else, or, my husband said, it could be this. Hopkins would interject and say, well, sure, because when people don't, accept this, that's what they're going to do. But what you need to do is to go with your feelings, is what you do. So basically what he was saying is, we have a schema, we have a kind of a belief system here, and I want everyone to support that particular belief system. So I saw pretty much everything that I needed to see when I saw that. Yet, I will say, when I read Missing Time, his first book, I was impressed by it. And to this day, I'm still impressed with some of the cases that he investigated and what came out of those cases. But yet, on the other hand, I don't know, there was something where he was just pushing an agenda. And again, this goes back to expectation and set, as we call it in psychology, in the hypnosis setting. No one comes into a hypnosis session with someone unless there's something about that person or what they have that you can relate to. Okay, so there's assumptions that are already built in about what you expect to get out of the experience by going to Bud Hopkins. And if you looked at most of those people, they had either read the books, and then at the bottom of, at the back of the book, it would say, if you think you've had an experience, contact me at blah, blah, blah. So for example, that was the way, like Debbie Cobble Jordan, okay, Intruders. That's the way she said that she got on a bus then and ran all the way to New York to meet Bud Hopkins because of all these experiences that she had had, but she had read his book. So I'm not saying that you can separate one from the other. This is where this goes in. This is where it becomes almost hopelessly intertwined. Hopelessly intertwined. Because how can we talk about objectivity? How can there ever be any objectivity in this? How do we ever know that someone's not doing, that the story or scenario that they have put forward doesn't involve something perhaps unconscious, or that has been reinforced at an unconscious level by the researcher or by other people that they're associating with. Other abductees go to abduction, counseling groups, and they share their experiences together, right?
Yeah, I remember.
So you say to yourself, okay, is that a good thing? Well, it might be a good thing emotionally. Maybe it's a good thing because I do think that people need to know that they have somebody that will listen to them. Without making judgment. Remember, we talked about how when I was on the lecture circuit, the one thing I found that was very, very interesting and satisfying to me was the fact that I had people coming up who had never shared their experience with anyone else, but suddenly something that I'm saying for the first time is making them feel that they can talk to me without fear of some sort of bad judgment, or that I'm going to put them into this box with a bunch of psychotics and so forth and so on. And that was very good, and these people that are talking to me know that I don't necessarily take a hard line one way or the other. The difference is when you're Bud Hopkins or you're John Mack or you're Leo Sprinkle, you already walk in with, a set of expectations, whether they are conscious or not, about what is going to happen.
Right.
So when we look at abduction experiences, I don't know what we're looking at. I really don't. I'm not sure. And this is not to say that I don't think there's a reality to the experiences. This is where when people take the view that I have, we get into trouble where people then say, oh, so you're a skeptic. Well, I'm a skeptic in the best sense of the word. I'm just not a debunker. There's a big difference. I'm not taking an a priori point of view saying that I think it's this or that. I'm saying maybe it's both. Maybe it could be one or the other. But there's only one way that we can find out, and that's by looking at other things other than just somebody's hypnosis experience. In other words, do we have ground traces? Now, in the case of Debbie Cobble Jordan, I don't know if you've followed her. Since she sort of came out of the alien closet and said, by the way, I was Debbie Cobble. I wasn't Debbie Jordan, was like a pseudonym, and here I am. And I saw her on a podcast, and then I started listening to her, and then I read her books. And she's a very, very smart, very intelligent. Well, I'm very glad that she's out there talking, because you get to see all the things that were happening. And there were a lot of things happening there that confirmed what I read in Hopkins' book. But also there were ground traces. She had chemical analysis done on the soil. There were multiple witnesses, some who came forward later and have coming forward now, who lived in the neighborhood, who remember some of these things and didn't talk about them. That's very interesting. Does it prove anything? No, but it certainly helps support the case or the narrative of that something was going on, other than just somebody imagining things or just riffing off of something unconscious during a hypnosis session being led by the very dominant Bud Hopkins, dominant in the sense that he's like a celebrity to people.
Mm-hmm.
or he was like a celebrity. And if you look at his ex-wife, I can't think of her name. That's terrible. I joined her Facebook group recently. Carol Ramey. Do you know that name at all?
Yes. I remember that she had come to a different conclusion about his use of the hypnosis, and
it's exactly the kinds of things that Keel was talking about with him, and I was talking about. I didn't publish this, I didn't write it because I didn't have any proof of this, but just from what I saw and from what Hopkins would say to me, and then other people would tell me the same thing, that he would become livid if you even dared suggest to him, well, maybe they made this up. And he would say, absolutely not. You don't know what you're talking about, And Carol Ramey, started seeing a lot of this and how it was coming unfrayed, and how Hopkins was just so locked into believing, he was believing his own narratives, and he was just forcing that narrative on everything that he saw. And then a perfect example of this is the case of Witnessed, the book, which I wrote a scathing review of for Fate, and caught all kinds of grief about it from David Jacobs and everyone else, including Jerry Clark, because they were all part of the same group. They were supporting one another. And I just felt it was the most ridiculous book. It had no evidence. It was very obvious to me that this was some sort of a hoax, and that she was at the center of it, inventing these things. Hopkins, I think, was seduced by her, perhaps figuratively, and, I don't know. I don't know that for a fact, but I think he was seduced by her, and she was very believable. If you listen to her testimony, it sounds believable. It's just the story is absolutely insane, and there's no real witnesses to any of this stuff. Ramey started becoming really perturbed by all of this and started documenting it. And if you go to her site, the carolramey.com, I think it is, she actually has excerpts of a film she was putting together that was going to expose all of these things. And what they are, private conversations between her and Hopkins, about what he was doing and why he thought. And it becomes very clear when you look at that, what was going on behind the scenes and how he was trying for everything. I think early on, I think a lot of his research was different. I think when he became sort of a celebrity, and a celebrity among abductees, it becomes part of that self-fulfilling prophecy, where you start seeing when you turn over every stone of something having to do with an alien, that there's definitely these grays and there's these experiments taking place, and they're all the same. I think one of the things too that's always bothered me is the sameness of it all. The sameness, just bothers me. It's interesting to me. I know human imagination is usually better than that, but there's some people that don't. They have an imagination, but you need to feed them. And once you feed them a scenario or a story, a lot of times they take it and then communicate it, and it's almost like a contagion where it starts infecting other people that are listening to you, that are trying to find a way to explain what happened when they missed 15 minutes of time during the day. I had people coming to me when I was doing the hypnosis saying, I lost 15 minutes and I don't know what happened. 15 minutes? I lose 15 minutes. I lose hours in the day now. I'm old, things I forget. But you're saying you lost 15 minutes, and this woman came to me, New Jersey, saw a light in the sky, and then went home, and then she was late by 15 minutes getting to this house, getting back to her home, and that was it. That was the whole experience. And on the basis of that, a friend of hers who knew Hopkins said, well, maybe you had an abduction experience. She goes, oh my gosh. And then she started having some dreams pertaining to an abduction, and she wanted to plumb that, she wanted to drill into that through hypnosis. And I said, no. And she was outraged that I wouldn't do that. And I said, I'm not going to do it. Find someone else. She said, well, you're typical. You're just another person that's just out there to squash. And I said, no, I'm absolutely not like that whatsoever. Not at all. But this is the problem. And we still have that problem today. Perhaps we have that problem more than ever before, you know, where it just seems to be an endless train of these, you know, and they're the same stories over and over again. And so, you know, then everyone points to the fact that they're all identical or similar and say, well, therefore, the fact that they're all similar must mean that they're pointing to a unified reality. There's an objective reality in back of them that generates the same experience because they're using the same techniques and so forth and so on. I have a hard time with that, you know.
I was a few months back, I interviewed a Swedish researcher, Claes Savon.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
And he works as a journalist for a prominent newspaper organization.
Yes.
He also works with AFU, the Archives for the Unexplained.
Yes.
And you know, in the interview, we talked about his research into ghost rockets that started up in Sweden back in 1946.
Right.
And it was really intriguing. In one single day when this phenomenon started up, it was July 19th, 1946. There were 4 separate incidents in different parts of Sweden where these rockets were seen. They were kind of resemble like the V rockets that the Germans had, and it caused a lot of fright. But in each instance where they would crash, they would go into a body of water. They might even turn around and go hit the water, and then a tremendous explosion. It could be very shallow. There would be rocks maybe thrown up on the shore.
Mm-hmm.
Multiple witnesses, and when divers went in, there would be nothing but a crater, you know. And then one instance eventually happened where a prominent person in the military had one of these experiences himself, and it happened that way. It was, you know, right after the war. There was all that fear built up, and it was like the phenomena was, instead of presenting there was nothing about it that was similar to. Because he interviewed about 50 people back in around 1980 or so. He located about 50 witnesses and gathered all the material he could. And he said he looked for, you know, what we find in the UFO phenomena today. And he says that wasn't there then. But it was impressive sightings. They never could identify. They would come in from all directions. So they never could figure out, you know, where these were coming from. And they never had any physical proof. And yet there was the physicality of where it would hit the water, and it would seek out sources of water, explode violently, and leave, you know, rocks on shore, a crater out in the water, and so on. But they couldn't find the craft itself. And he said that during the war, I think 1944, there was a one of the V rockets from Germany that crashed in southern Sweden. There was 2.2 tons of wreckage from that.
Yeah.
But in these instances, nothing. And I thought, wow. So really, you know, Keel always said a lot of the contact experiences or whatever encounters seem to unfold based upon our expectations. And
absolutely. Absolutely. There is no question in my mind that plays a pivotal role in many of these narratives, that much of it is the anticipation of something based on something that's happened. And what has happened very often doesn't have to be authentic. It could be fake. That's one of the most interesting things to me is how you could have an event where there's a hoax, okay? An object is seen, a light comes out of it, so forth, and the experience ends. And then it's determined that this was done with a balloon, with lights or so forth. It's a hoax. Shortly thereafter, there's a series of other events that take place in which almost a replica of that particular object is seen performing the exact same thing, which the debunkers and skeptics are quick to dismiss as a hoax. Why? Because we had this antecedent phenomenon that was declared to be a hoax that was almost identical to it. So what are the odds? What are the odds that something authentic can materialize when in fact a week before we had something that was clearly a hoax? No. You know, using Occam's razor, if we're looking at this critically, we have to say no. But see, that's the thing. So we're in a field in which the trickster motif is apparent all the time. You know, it plays like that all the time throughout history. And so at some point, you just have to say, look, even if there's physical evidence, so-called physical evidence, even if I shoot a Bigfoot and I know there's blood on the ground and I go to it and I determine, oh, like Stan Gordon, one of his cases, and somebody did this, they came out, I don't know if you remember this, they shot the creature and it was on their porch, and they came out and shot at this creature took off or whatever. They come out, they see what they thought was blood all over it. It turns out it was like a group of apples that were in a basket that she had shot at, and it was just all the remnants of the apples.
Oh, okay.
So there's this, like Schwarz used to call it humoresque. You know, there's always this comical thing. Keel talks about the play on names, funny town names, similarity with the witnesses and so forth. And when I was into all of that and I was doing the research and all these things were happening, because like Robert Anton Wilson used to call it the synchronicity net. In other words, when you're involved emotionally in something or you're engaged in this kind of phenomenon, very often you get stuck in what he called the synchronicity net. There's like this net but it just surrounds you. This is what makes this so maddening. It surrounds you. So all of a sudden there's all these synchronicities that are happening and you think this is a communication directly to you, which it is in a sense. And you try to share it with everyone around you or even people right next to you, and you realize they're looking at you like you need, to have, brain surgery, because they're not experiencing any of this and they're right nearby. They don't see it. They're not experiencing it. They're not hearing it. They're not having these synchronicities. And then when you pull out of that, when you remove yourself from the net, you extricate yourself, it stops. And I saw this personally every time that I was involved in the phenomenon and in the research, in the trenches, researching, studying, looking at newspaper articles, musing about it at night. All these things, I was stuck in the net, and all these things would start happening to me. But the minute I would remove myself from that sphere and go into what we might call conventional life, a lot of ufologists don't do this, by the way. They don't have a life. They're not like you, Brent, where they have a family and a life and they have an experience outside of this. And I think that's what makes you special and much more interesting. People that tell me this is all I do all day, I worry about those people. I really do. If you do this all the time and are stuck in the synchronicity net, you're going to drive yourself insane. Look at David Jacobs. I mean, David Jacobs went from being a pretty respectable researcher. His book on the history of ufology is still one of the best books I ever read. This seemed to be a very sane man. But if you read The Threat, did you ever read these latter books?
Yeah, I've got The Threat. Yeah.
I mean, after a while, it's like, and I wrote in one of the reviews, I said he said he was at Barnes and Noble and this was happening, and I said I said he needed decaf, because he had too much caffeine in his system. He's starting to see too many things, And again, people think I'm being cruel or nasty. I'm not. I'm just saying I know from experience if you get involved in this, after a while it plays with you and it can make you nuts. Look at Keel in the 60s when he was telling everybody they should wear gas masks because the contactee from Long Island that was feeding him all this nonsense was warning him about this and about that. And yeah, some of it, and again, this is typical with contactee lore and about psychics. I've worked with, hundreds of different psychics. Some of it can be truthful. Some of it bears out. A lot of it, you'll just never know. So, but if you get tied into each thing, you're going to be looking for patterns that very often don't exist. And I think Keel is a perfect example of somebody who is in it completely. He was in the Synchronicity Net. Everything that was happening is, oh my God, that's an MIB. Oh my God, there's these people down in West Virginia that look like me, Meanwhile, you got the tricksters, living tricksters, as well as those that are, part of the cosmos. You have Gray Barker and Jim Moseley involved in doing things to make Keel nuts, right?
Yeah.
Feeding his paranoia, which Moseley told me about, how they loved playing on him at that time. Those two were like insane. Jerry Clark hated them. He said they're making a mockery of ufology, as if ufology has any sort of respectability, making a mockery of it. No, actually, Jim Moseley was a very smart man who had a very, very good view of the whole thing. He just thought, to me was like the circus leader who just says, I'm just going to be the ringmaster for this circus. And I'm going to put this all in my newsletter and let everybody fight. And I'm not going to take any side on it because I don't have a particular point of view. The bottom line, he always felt there was something to the phenomenon, as did Barker. They thought there was something there, but they couldn't figure it out. But they were fascinated by the characters, and they loved to get drunk and have fun, Yeah.
Yeah, his saucer smear at times I'd open it up and I'd be kind of depressed, like this is crazy, And then finally, Keel wrote him and said, "You're a boil on the ass of ufology." You remember
that?
Oh,
it's great.
And so he put it right up near the title front page,
But for a long time, let me tell you, they tortured Keel. They tortured him. They did all kinds of pranks and things, and I believe, this is my own view, I think a lot of what happened, with Mothman and all that, happened. But I think there was a lot of other stuff that I swear had Barker and Moseley's hand in it, especially with the MIB stuff, Yeah. And Keel fell for it. And you could see that when you look back at the old letters, when Keel is writing everyone, including Jerry Clark. Jerry had shared some private letters, that Keel had written back, which I promised him I would never share, and I won't. But it's very clear when you looked at that at the time this was happening, first of all, Jerry was enthralled with Keel back at that time period. He was right? And so Keel considered Jerry very smart, very intelligent. And Jerry said, I was very impressionable at the time. He doesn't have the point of view now, obviously, he had back then. But he said, at the time, I was very influenced by everything Keel said, and I came to accept everything he said. But when you look at the letters, you could see that Keel was just so massively paranoid about everything, And I'm not saying there was no reason for it. I'm just saying that if you allow that to happen, and fear, and Keel always said, fear is the enemy. He said, fear is the equivalent of emotional quicksand. I always loved that because I related to it. And again, unless you've been an investigator and you've been there, you don't know what that feels like.
He also used the expression, belief is the enemy too.
Belief is the enemy, but it is the enemy. See, so little has changed. That's what's amazing about Keel. So little of none of this has really changed. There are still very few people that say, I don't necessarily believe in this, or I don't think there's enough evidence for this, but, they straddle the fence. There's some that are out there. You got people like Joshua Cutchin, which I liked. I liked his point of view. That's another point of view, and I think it's important that he catalogs everything. He catalogs everything. So even if you're just looking for a catalog of weird smells, right, during cryptid experience or whatever, go to Joshua Kitchen, right?
Yeah.
Greg Bishop, right? Christopher O'Brien. There are some of these guys that are out there, and some people that are out there. I think, Erica Lukes, in Utah with the Skinwalker Ranch, started coming to a slightly different view about some of the things that were happening there when she got married to somebody who used to actually work at the ranch, and blah, blah, blah. And if you ever get a chance to listen to those, that's fascinating stuff,
Mhm.
But what I like about her is, and she's putting together, by the way, speaking of Ann Druffel, she has the entire collection of Ann Druffels. She arranged to actually take the entire collection that Ann Druffel had, the entire library, her collected correspondence, and she's now digitalizing all of it.
Oh, wow.
And I think that's great, because Ann Druffel has a lot of important things to say, and I think people could learn. And some of this correspondence that a lot of people haven't seen between her and Hynek and Vallée, it's important historically to look back at that. You get clues off of it. I don't know if you've ever read all of Forbidden Science. Those
No, I
are,
haven't.
oh my God. If you just go back to the first one, volume 1, the 60s, it just really gives you an interesting perspective, because he's taking everything down as it's happening. Every single event that took place, he's taking it down. And if you go back now and look at it, you go, oh, wow, there were early signs that Majestic 12 was a hoax. There's early signs of this based on these little comments he makes.
Mhm.
To me,
Yeah.
the importance of all of that is, there's only so many hours in a day, but I think a lot of people could spend a lot more productive time instead of just listening to a lot of meaningless podcasts or things that just support their point of view. Pull away from it and just start looking at the entire spectrum of things,
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, the trickster, George Henson, Paranormal and the Trickster, was it? Or, anyway,
That's probably one of the best books. Actually, there's two on the Trickster that I really like. One is Christopher O'Brien's. I think it's called Stalking the Trickster. And the other is George Hansen, which is a much more academic book. And
yeah.
at times, it became so complex to me, I didn't even really understand parts of it. But that's me. But his analysis of Hopkins and what happened with the witness case and how it ties into the Trickster events and all that, I thought was just wonderful. And it's, again, any of us who have been involved in this long enough know that sooner or later the Trickster is going to rear its head, and it's going to make you look foolish. That's what it does. Just when you think you've got the perfect photo, you realize, oh, there was no film in the camera. Or just when you think, I don't know, you have a great recording and you realize the batteries have gone dead. Or just when you think, oh, I've got blood dripping off of a statue. I had a case of stigmata that I was researching up in Massachusetts some years ago, where it looked like there was blood coming, off of it, and other oils. And when they were analyzed, it was all linseed oil or soybean oil dripping out of the statue's eyes. What does that mean? We don't know. I mean, in what way does that prove anything? It doesn't. It's, again, hate to go back to Keel, but Keel said the phenomenon delights in discrediting itself.
Yeah.
And it does. It constantly discredits itself, oftentimes by just making either the witnesses look stupid or foolish, or just making everything nonsensical. It's very good at that. That's the one thing it's very good at, making everything appear to be, unsolvable, and we could look at everything. We could look at anything that's been studied in this, going all the way back from the contactees, right, where we have little minutia, little things that happen that seem to support the contactee experience, but then there's a whole mass of other things that definitely support the fact that there's hoaxing involved, right? And all that, all the way up to crop circles. I looked into that rigorously, and I've never experienced it personally. Didn't fly out to, England to actually look into it. I wasn't that interested, but I read every single book I could, Colin Andrews, all of them. Looked into that from this side, that side, and I still say, yeah, I think some of them, absolutely, hoaxes, very good hoaxes. Some of them, no, I don't think so. Some of them that appeared to be hoaxes, when the crop circle makers would go into the circle, I don't know if you read about this, said, I hate to say this because we were out to disprove the phenomenon, but when we actually started walking into the circle we had created, we started experiencing weird things.
Yeah.
Where they become dizzy, or they'd have electromagnetic effects or electrostatic effects. Interesting. So
see a ball of light themselves.
Yeah. So again, we go back to this idea of, I brings to mind, remember the Gulf Breeze case. So the Gulf Breeze case, a momentous amount of evidence that there was hoaxing going on. Okay. But we also have to point to cases independent from him and his experiences of people in the community and surrounding communities that were experiencing almost the identical type of craft, performing the exact same kinds of maneuvers. What do we make of that?
Yeah,
we don't make anything of it, because ultimately we can't say anything except there appears to be this trickster aspect in which there's mimicry. Now, in poltergeist cases, this happens all the time. And see, early on, when I became interested in haunting, I was mostly interested in haunting and poltergeists in the beginning. Not because of any experience. I never had experiences when I was young. I never had ghost experience. I never had UFO experiences. I never had synchronicity experiences. I never had any of it. So I was a tabula rasa as far as an experimenter go. It was the perfect chance for me to see if there's anything going on. I tended to be very, very skeptical of everything, because the first books I actually read, because I was an amateur magician when I was a kid, was Harry Houdini. I was fascinated with Harry Houdini. So as a result of me reading everything I could about Harry Houdini, I inevitably became aware of the fact that Harry Houdini really was vehemently opposed to the possibility of paranormal phenomena being real, and got into all kinds of nasty disagreements with Arthur Conan Doyle, right? So there was this feud. So I read everything I could about that. I thought that was interesting. I thought Houdini was really like a great magician, but he was also a scientist, And he was actually someone who actually believed the possibility of life after death, but thought there were so many fakes around, he was determined to figure out how they were doing it. And who better to figure out how somebody could be, defrauding people, but Harry Houdini, the greatest escape artist of all time. So that was my entree into it. It's not the typical entree. People say, well, when I had this experience of that. That was my entree. So when I got involved in it, I had this perspective of, I want to be like Harry Houdini. I'm never going to be a great magician, but I want to be like him. I want to say, there's a possibility that this is real. There's something going on, but I think there's a lot of trickery and fakery, and there's different ways you can fake photographs, like the Cotton fairies. Remember that with Arthur Conan Doyle? Okay, so that was what I decided I was going to do. And I was in my teens. That's where I was going to do. I didn't know how I was going to do this, but that was always going to be my interest. And that perspective hasn't changed much, even now. That's the way I look at things. I read something and I'll say, while everybody else is getting all excited, I'm like, I don't know. When the Tic Tac thing happened, I went, government revealing something? Be careful. Be careful. Been there, done that. No, 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 no. Why are you looking there? Let's look away from there. Let's get back to research. That's what they don't want you doing. They don't want you uncovering something, because if you're delving into UFOs too thoroughly, you may uncover something they don't want you to know about that has nothing to do with aliens necessarily. It could have to do with technology. That's the bottom line. Technology. For the government, it's technology, right? Mm-hmm. For the CIA, it's psychology. And how do we get people distracted? That's the CIA, that's the NSA, that's the DIA, and that's why even with Skinwalker Ranch, you got to say to yourself, that's interesting. Colm Kelleher and Bigelow and all of these people are connected to somebody who's a journalist, right? And they write a book together to reveal everything they know about their hunt for the Skinwalker. Not an academic book, just for the public to see everything. You have to say to yourself, at least I question it and say, why are they doing that? Why would they do that? Why wouldn't they keep that private if they're getting information? Why are they revealing it to the public? What is the motive of that? But rather than get all obsessed with that, which leads you nowhere, right? Because we're never going to know one way or the other. What I say is just get involved with things around you that are happening or events and look into them. And then if you can, publish your findings and let other people maybe, expand upon that particular research. And maybe at least you bring some light to some of the phenomena that's happening. And that will be helpful, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, just I recently was communicating with George Knapp, and
right, that's who I was thinking of, right? George Knapp.
He's going to have me on Coast to Coast early Monday morning. That would be between 2 and 4 my time Central, so it's going to be a late night. But I've expressed an interest in the hitchhiker phenomena with the Skinwalker Ranch, and I heard about these people having the experience, and I asked him if he had, and he said, well, he had, or said mainly really his wife. So I hope to get into that and find out some
yeah, and I don't know if you read, so there was the hunt for the Skinwalker, and then there was a follow-up to that. I think it's called Pentagon.
Skinwalker at the
right,
Pentagon,
and that goes into
mm-hmm.
some of the hitchhiker phenomenon. That
right.
goes into it.
Which would really be Keel's reflective factor type thing that he talked about, where the phenomena turns reflective, which gets into synchronicities too.
Yeah, and absolutely. And again, going back, just going to circle back to my early research that took me from Harry Houdini and into ghosts and poltergeists. I was especially interested in poltergeists, and the reason, because I figured, well, if I'm looking for evidence, rather than just looking at a static photo or looking at some audio clip of an EVP, why don't I see if I can find something or actually see objects hurtling through the air, and even if other people dispute it, I can say that I saw that, or I actually witnessed something like that. So poltergeists were always like something I was really, really interested in. And so then I started reading all the books on poltergeist, and of course, William Roll. I don't know if you know the name, Dr. Mm-hmm. William Roll. So also passed. A.R.G. Owen, who wrote a book called Can We Explain the Poltergeist, from Cambridge University. I read all of these, and all these people had kind of an academic background. They were kind of clinical. What I would call an actual parapsychologist versus what Keel used to call self-styled parapsychologists in tennis sneakers. I love that. It just meant like everybody thought they were a parapsychologist. That you don't have a psychology degree, number one. Parapsychologists tend to be most of them, very stodgy, and they're very scientific, but they do everything's evidence-based, and that's where I came from at that point. I was like, I just want to do everything by the book. Make sure there's controls, make sure I understand what delusion is, make sure I understand if somebody's on medication, what kind of medications they're on that might lead to an epileptic seizure, an aura, or might lead to the perception of something that isn't there, hallucinations. I think a grounding in psychology is very important for that. And even if you're not a psychologist, you should work with one. If you're going to investigate something, you should work with a historian, right? Historian's good. A psychologist, right? A physicist would be good. A chemist, in case there's some sort of, some sort of a trace that's left or something where somebody can do analysis and so forth and so on. So at the time, I didn't have a connection to any group or anything like that. So I joined Bill Roll's group, which was called Psychical Research Foundation. Located near Duke University, North Carolina, pretty well esteemed. And Roll had a group, and you could join, and you could be an investigator. And I became an investigator for New Jersey, and he started sending me cases, and I started researching. And one of the first cases that I had, this will interest you, was up in Hackettstown, New Jersey, right? Mm-hmm. Hackettstown is...
That sounds familiar.
Here's why it's going to be familiar to you. Hackettstown is located right next door to Long Valley, New Jersey, okay? Long Valley is where the spook light is, the mystery light that I wrote about in that article that you referenced, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, I didn't know anything about the mystery light or spook light or anything like that. I didn't know anything about Hackettstown. So I go there and I investigate my first poltergeist case. I won't go into all the details. I had published this in Fate and some follow-ups on it as well. But one of the things that I noticed about it is that, I noticed a lot of things that Roll had talked about, which was the interpersonal stress within the family that often precipitates or seems to have a contribution to poltergeistry. That was the first thing I noticed. Second thing I noticed was that this sort of sat on a bedrock of quartz crystals in this particular area. In fact, I found there was a lot of it located throughout that particular area. And of course, quartz is often associated with piezoelectricity, okay? And mystery lights, okay? So I started getting involved in that. And from that particular case, I started to learn that within the neighborhood itself, that there were more than just one or two cases of poltergeistry that were happening, that there were 3 or 4. So very often, I would leapfrog from one case, which is on this part of the block, to the opposite side of the block, where these people don't even know one another. But these are things that people have heard through the grapevine that they're reporting to me, that they heard, and then they would reach out to these people and they would agree, so often reluctantly, to sit down with me, and only if I promised not to use their names, to be anonymous. And they would report things that were very similar to what had just been reported to me by this family that's been going on for 2 years. Often, sometimes, some of these families would report to me spontaneously. They, had UFO experiences. They had Bigfoot sightings. They had out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, so forth and so on. Synchronicity electrical disturbances, phone calls from the dead. Remember Rogo's book on that? I would get cases of that. This was all happening in 1976. Remember I said 1976 seems to have been a banner year for all kinds of weirdness, Fortean weirdness throughout the country, right? 76 to 78, I would say that was, at least for me, from my perception, that's what was going on. So I started realizing too, some of these people had left the neighborhood. They had put their house up for sale in this same neighborhood, moved to another house, and the phenomenon followed them. This gets back to what you were talking, your original point, or suggestion about the hitchhiker effect, or what we used to call contagion. In other words, that it's almost like a virus, and somebody picks up this virus and then it goes with them. To Bill Roll and many people who were poltergeist parapsychologists, it was obvious to them that it's the emotional stress within the family that's creating this. It's creating a cauldron, emotional cauldron, in which this experience is taking root. And therefore, the reason it's following them is because it's coming from them. It's not coming from an external force or entity. There's nothing discarnate going on. It's all what they call recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis, which is just a very fancy word for the fact that it's an exteriorization of something happening within the person, and it's being projected out into the environment. And it's being caused by strife that has not been settled, very often marital stress, or some cases, the case I had in Hackettstown, the original case, involved sexual abuse of one of the children by the father in the case, in the house. He eventually committed suicide. He was 13 years of age. And what they found was a Bible. And when they opened it, there was a piece of paper in it. And on that piece of paper, this boy, who I'd come to know pretty well, wrote, "Please tell Mr. Jordan that I can no longer stand the voices in my head." It was one of the most emotional things it was my first experience, and it was very emotional.
Yeah.
So regardless of what we think of whether he was schizophrenic or whatever, it all happened within this environment where there were all kinds of things cited. Now, I never personally experienced any of those things because it always turned out the trickster was never far away from me. When I would go to the house, I'd be there for an hour or two. I'd go through every room. We'd take all these pictures, do all this. After all the interviews were conducted, I get back in my car, drive home. Within an hour, I get a phone call saying, "Oh my God, you're not going to believe what happened. The minute you got in your car and you drove away, a cigarette that I had in an ashtray," the wife tells me this, "started rising up out of the ashtray." Now, meanwhile, nothing had happened in the preceding 3 hours. Was she lying? I don't believe so, because she was very upset. And all the children were screaming to call me and have me come back. And of course, at the time, I lived in Union, New Jersey, so I was a good 2 hours away from Hackettstown,
Mm-hmm.
But these were some of my initial experiences with things where the phenomenon seems to follow people. So what I always find interesting, again, this goes back, I find it kind of funny, that investigators like Coleman, Kelleher, and others are talking about the Hitchhiker Effect when it's something that was well known and experienced and reported by so many researchers back in the day. It's nothing new. It's nothing new. It might be new to Coleman, Kelleher. It might have been new to the Bigelow people, but it's certainly not new within the literature. It's something that's constantly reported.
There's so much, as you were talking about, Hackett, the Long Valley, Hackettstown, the Long Valley experience. And there's all these things I've been thinking of, but it's like, I can't interrupt you right now because this is so fascinating. But, I even think about your investigation into, Howard Menger, the contactee, and the thing that was told you, and the very synchronistic, weird experience you had there. And I also, that Bob Jones with Vestigia, that whole thing, and the it was I was told, and I think it was Tom Bearden told me that he got out when he was having so many synchronicities and weird things happen to him that he got out of the field because of
I had heard that too. Yes.
Apparently there was like Bigfoot was getting closer and closer to where he lived.
Wow.
And it kind of,
we when I was in Vestigia, we had a lot of interactions with Bearden because I forget exactly. It was with the Mystery Light. I think he was writing about it, or he was interested in that aspect of it. But he came to some of our meetings. Got to meet him. I always thought he was a very interesting guy. I often wondered what happened to him. I didn't know that was the experience. But that is typical of a lot of the researchers that have been in this field for a long time, is they suddenly just leave. Keel used to say to me, so, I mean, this will find, you'll find this kind of interesting. after I went to graduate school and got my degree and all that, and I told him I was getting kind of disillusioned with, the research and all that, and I decided I was, I had been not only a magician, I was a musician and actually a serious guitar player when I was a kid. And then from there, I went into bands, and then I would play solo guitar, And so I was always heavily into music and everything. So I was very comfortable being on stage. I never had a problem, no stage fear for me. So I had told Keel, I said, you know what, I went to Catch a Rising Star comedy club with a couple of friends. I saw people doing open mic nights, and comedy was just starting up. It was getting pretty popular. I said, I think I'm going to be doing a comedian. I think I might try doing stand-up and try to get into the improv in New York. And Keel, as you know this, right, was a comedy, had written comedy for Merv Griffin, a lot of other shows. A lot of people don't know that. That's why he was very funny. That's why I used to take everything Keel said with a grain of salt sometimes, because I didn't know if he was completely kidding or not, because he was very funny. He could be very, very funny. And I think, and I found that great, because a lot of the investigators were just too serious. Are you serious? And, and that's where paranoia creeps in, because you try to keep things a little bit more light, or at least have some sort of humanity. Don't just think, have a sense of humor about things. But no, you can't make a criticism of this, or if you say something sarcastic, they go, that's offensive, And I never got that. Keel was kind of like me in that regard. And when I told him I was going to go into stand-up, I was thinking about it. He goes, you should. He goes, I'll never forget this. He goes, I always knew that you were the smart one, because you were going to get out of this. He goes, this is such a waste of time. He goes, if I had known what I know now, I would never have gotten involved. He said, because it's a waste of time. You're never going to get anywhere. People think, but my point of view is going to get me, it's the search for the Holy Grail. He say it's like a Grail-like quest where people just think, I just need the one case that's going to break it open. He goes, we haven't made any progress. What progress have we made? It's the same patterns. It's just in a different guise. So where does it all end? And that's kind of where I ended up now, at the same place that he was at then. He knew better, which is, don't go squandering your money or your hopes and your dreams, And I had gotten married recently, and he says, you know what? This will tear a lot of marriage. It's torn a lot of marriages apart. It's just an obsession that leads to paranoia, that often leads, like in my case, he said, to financial disaster. Because he was pretty much broke when I knew him. He wasn't doing well, and he was getting sicker and sicker. He didn't have medical care. I remember going to the hospital. He was taken by an emergency to Presbyterian Hospital in New York. I forget what it was. I don't know if it was heart. I don't know what. He had so many problems, And I remember seeing him there, and he was just going progressively downhill. I remember being in his apartment. Oh my God! And there's just like racks of newspaper articles and journal entries and boxes of stuff he was working on. And then I just remember him sitting there, and he was eating a TV dinner, and I thought, oh my God, I haven't had that since I was like 4 years old. I mean, that's what he was down to doing. He would tell me he would get it when it was on sale. And I thought, this is, as much as I admired him, to me, it was sad and it was pathetic. And I said, you know what? As much as I'm really interested in all of this, he's absolutely right. He said to me, have a life outside of this. And you know who's done that really, really well? Nick Redford. Do you know Nick Redford?
Yeah, I've got some of his books, and
I don't know if you ever heard of his schedule. So he works on his book. When he's working on a book, he works like, he'll get up early in the morning. He has his breakfast when he gets coffee. He has a whole schedule, and he works like all the way through from the morning to night. And then when 6 or 7 o'clock p.m. comes, he stops. And then he goes and he says, and then I have a life. I go and I eat, I go out with my friend. He's into like headbanger music or metal, heavy metal. They go to different clubs to see bands and they have some drinks and they party and he comes home and then the next morning he starts again. And then when the weekend comes, he says, I shelve everything and then I just go and meet with friends and never talk about this, never interact with it. And that's how he's managed. You know, he's been doing that for about 5 years. He's got a lot of books. And
he does.
And he's another one that doesn't have he doesn't have a pony in the race. I think it's good not to have a pony in the race because he just writes he says, let me see if there's an alternate point of view to this. If you don't accept it, fine, but consider it. And I got to tell you, there's little gems hidden in some of his notes, like things that I would never hear from a ufologist, things that he tells me of a case I would never get from a Bigfoot researcher. You know, things about Loch Ness that I never knew about Loch Ness and about all the cases and all the other stuff that seems to suggest it ain't what you think it is. You know, I think all these things have a place on your shelf and should be considered. But what I'm talking about with him is keeping your sanity. And I ran into stand-up comedy, and I remember I invited John Keel. He came to one of my performances at the Improv, you know, and and he said to me, he goes, keep doing what you're doing. He goes, to hell with all that, hell with UFOs, hell with all that shit. He goes, it's nonsense. He goes, it's nonsense. He goes, I'm not saying and he wasn't saying, look, there's nothing to it. He was saying there's plenty to it, but it's inscrutable. And you're going to drive yourself nuts if you think you're going to put it in a box. You know, I often think like, you know, I was listening to a podcast the other day and somebody said, we're really making a lot of progress now in ufology. We're making a lot of progress that we never made before. And I wanted to say, what are you talking about? What progress? There hasn't been progress. You're saying scientifically there's progress? What have we really learned? I think what we have learned is that the same mistakes have been made in the past. The same phenomenon has been seen from time immemorial, and it's just being redressed. And I mean, I'm not saying it's not interesting.
Yeah.
But I don't understand how you could be a clinical parapsychologist and think by doing a couple of studies, you're going to prove anything. You know, I know we talked about Jeffrey Mishlove, who was always one of my idols, you know, because he was a true parapsychologist, PhD, right? Evidence-based, you know, and wrote a lot of great stuff on parapsychology. He wrote a huge, it's called the Handbook of Parapsychology. It was phenomenal. When I was starting out, I read that, I go, I want to be like that, you know? And then all of a sudden he started looking into other things. And then he looked into the Ted Sirios things. And let me tell you, if it wasn't for him, I would never have even glanced at Ted Sirios or the case.
I know. I got.
And I asked you, and I said to you, no. I said to you, as I've said to other people, have you ever read this? And you said to me, I never knew what to make of that. That's what you said. And I thought, that's what everybody says that I talk to, regardless of who they are. And I said, consider the source. And I knew you didn't really know much about him. And I said, this man is more evidence-based than anybody in the world. He has studied this as much as anyone can study something like that, like somebody can control the weather patterns. I mean, it's crazy to think you can study that. How can you tell? But I think he did a damn good job of showing that some of these things that happen just can't be total coincidence. If it happened once or twice, but man, a lot of times he could do things on demand, regardless of whether it's the SIs or whatever it is. He had something. Again, talking about people that I wish I had met. I had opportunities and I didn't go to conferences where he was, and I should have, because I always found him, I found that, just like I found Ted Sirios, very, very interesting. Psychologically, I found it interesting. And I read, Mishlov's study, and he was just lambasted by the community. They thought he was like a traitor. How could you study that or say there's any reality to that? And I'll tell you something, if you listen to his program, it's not like he's coming out as a conspiracy buff, or that he's coming out saying, yes, everything Whitley Strieber said is true, everything about abductions is true. I've always liked the way how nuanced his point of view is, and Thinking Aloud is a great podcast. Mm-hmm. That's a great podcast. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I came to interview Jeffrey Mishlove after we talked.
I know you did. And I was so happy. Because I thought, you're missing out. And the thing is, some people don't pay any attention to him. They don't pay any attention to him. Like, oh, I don't know, or he's too erudite. I heard some people say, oh, he's too smart, too erudite. Oh, yeah, God forbid you're erudite. What's wrong with that? I mean, he's not obnoxious, and he's one of the nicest people in the world. And I'm so happy that he's still out there,
Yeah. I think he's 75 now, still going strong.
Amazing. Bless him,
Yeah.
It's great. So as long as there's people like him that are doing this, and people like Greg Bishop or, Joshua Cutchin or even, what's his name? Seraphia. Where Did the Road Go? Did you ever listen to that?
Yeah, I've been on his show.
You've been on that one.
And I've interviewed him.
Oh, wait a minute. I think I heard the one that you were, it was about Keel?
Yeah.
Right. And then I heard you, were you on the 6 Degrees of Keel? What's their names?
Barbara Fisher, yeah.
Yeah, another nice one. No, it's good. Yeah. Some of those are very, very good and very informative. And I learn quite a bit from them.
She lives in Athens, Ohio, which is very close because Mary Hyre worked for the Athens Messenger.
Right.
And she's had a lot of interesting experiences herself. She's definitely an experiencer and a researcher, and she's quite objective, I find, about all her research. In fact, I just was writing her, trying to get her feedback on some things just the other day. So, I mean, I have a lot of respect for her views as well.
Listen, can we pause for a second?
Yeah, sure. Let's see. Let me